All right, so then we are finishing up Rudolf Steiner's Egyptian Myths and Mysteries here. This is chapter 12, the final chapter in this particular lecture cycle. Steiner begins by saying in this cycle, now that when we look back over these post-Atlantean civilizations, we can see that as we move from India to Persia to Egypt to the Greco-Latin period, that there has been a gradual mastery over the physical plane. That when we have come to the fifth of these post-Atlantean civilizations, which is our civilization, the fifth of these, which is in resonance to a certain extent, as we'll see with the Egyptian. What we have done is to achieve a total mastery over the physical plane, and he says that spiritual science does not necessarily criticize this, because spiritual science sees the necessity for the conquest over the physical plane. It was something that was evolutionarily necessary, but in a certain sense, man today has descended so far into physical matter. The Greeks, at least, though they did descend into physical matter, still were able to imprint the spirit and their spirituality into their works of art, so that their works of art still radiated with a certain degree of spirituality. But today this is not the case, because we have descended so far into matter that we have actually become slaves of the physical plane, so that the physical plane actually tyrannizes over us to the degree that there's nothing really left over for us to, there's only a certain amount of energy available to a given one of these epochs, and we've used it all up in mastery over the physical plane, so there's nothing left for really to develop the spirit world and our relationship to spiritual forces. And he says that what is it to the spirit that, we can make a telephone call from Hamburg and order supplies across the water from America that will be brought to us by steamer? What good does this do the spirit? It doesn't do any good for it. It may be necessary in spiritual evolution for us to go through this process, but the Christ impulse was what came down in the middle of the Greco-Latin period, especially in its most decadent phase, the Roman phase, to come down and then pave the way for us to reascend back into the realms of the spirit. So we have this at our disposal. And then he gets into this idea about memory and group souls, and he says that now when we remember back over our lives, we remember back over our individual lives, all we can really recall are the earliest events of our childhood. We can't remember anything back beyond that, and our sense of individuality just comes from the name that we have that refers to our lives between birth and death. But he says in Atlantis, during Atlantean times, this was not the case, because individuals there could still participate in a very large group soul as members of a group consciousness to such a degree that they could actually remember the lives of their previous ancestors going many centuries back. And he says that echoes of this can still be seen in the fact that in the Old Testament, the patriarchs have such long lives. Adam lives for however many number of years it is, maybe it's 300 or 400. But that really is an echo. It refers to the individual being able to remember, not necessarily past lifetimes in the reincarnation sense. It's just that they can remember back through the lives of their ancestors. Their memories extended back further, so that as the post-Atlantean civilization wound down, they began to lose contact with this. Now, in the first post-Atlantean civilization with the Indians, they could still remember this to a certain extent, and they made a distinction between two different paths: the path of the fathers, Pitriyana, or the path of the gods, Devayana. And he says this parallels the realm of Kamaloka, which is the realm that you go to immediately after you die and you have a life review, and you remember the events of your lifetime backwards in reverse for one individual lifetime. And we spend, therefore, a relatively short time in Kamaloka, but when we go into the higher realms of Devashan, this is what the Hindus call Devayana or Devashan, the way of the gods or the path of the gods. We spend quite a long time, as he says, in Devashan. He doesn't specify how long at this point. I think elsewhere he says it's a third the length of whatever your lifetime was. But back then, for people who died in the first post-Atlantean civilization, they would go onto the other side. And because in Kamaloka they could still remember the lives of their ancestors, they spent a much longer time in Kamaloka and a comparatively brief time when they went to the way of the gods in Devashan. It was a much shorter time that they spent in between lives during that period. So the group soul has contracted over time to the point where now we just think of ourselves as individuals. And when we think of a people, a population, what we really think of is just the sum total of the number of persons living in a geographical area. But he says that isn't a people. A people is embedded in a folk soul. And he says that there is such a thing as a folk soul. It's not something you can see, so we don't count it in our civilization, which takes serious only things that can be seen and touched and heard and felt and so forth, because the group soul is etheric. And peoples do have etheric bodies, that's the group soul, and they also have astral bodies. And individuals should be seen as embedded within these, like little, if an individual corresponds to a little tiny circle, the individual should be seen in relation to the group soul the way a finger should be seen as part of an entire body. You're part of a group soul. And to an Egyptian initiate, in the third of these post-Atlantean civilizations, the Egyptian initiate would have perceived this and would have seen that the relationship to the group soul was the influence of Isis. Isis dwelt in the etheric body of a group, of a people, whereas Osiris signified the individual. But for the Egyptians, individuality wasn't quite the same thing, because each individual pharaoh thought of himself as Horus, the son of Isis and Osiris. And of course, each Egyptian pharaoh was the incarnation of Horus, as the dead pharaoh was always Osiris. The dead pharaoh was referred to as Osiris, and Re, the sun god, was the relationship between them. So that our sense of individuality has really undergone a major transformation over time, and contracted and contracted and contracted until we just think of ourselves as this individual who lives in this biological lifetime between birth and death. But the reality is that we are embedded in these folk souls, which are much larger entities that we are a part of. And the folk souls also have astral bodies that each individual within that folk soul gives a certain coloration to the sense of an astral body of a people. And with regard to Western civilization, then, we have had a process of mastery over the physical plane, but nonetheless, we still are the same souls who were incarnated in Egypt and also in the Greco-Latin civilization. And there are memories within us that are at deep, deep subconscious levels or unconscious levels, deeper perhaps even than the Jungian collective unconscious, which is an instinctive memory base that has nothing to do with individual memory. But we can remember even further back to such a degree that we are in a certain resonance as the fifth post-Atlantean civilization with the Egyptian civilization. He has already pointed out such a resonance at the start of this lecture cycle when he pointed out in the first lecture that the process of mummification affected our interest in the physical plane, because in Kamaloka, when the individual went and looked down at his physical body having been mummified, it actually tied him to the physical plane, and it had something to do with our obsession with the physical plane and our desire for mastery over it in our epoch, the fifth post-Atlantean epoch. So there's a relationship. And he says that even such individuals, as we have mentioned before, like Darwin in a previous lecture where we said that Darwin's idea of our descent from the animals is a memory of the fact that the Egyptians felt themselves as descendants of animal-headed gods. And so there was a certain resonance in that sense. He says also that an individuality like Copernicus, who with his book De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium, which was published in 1543, which put in place the heliocentric system that we've, of course, inherited, is a memory of this Egyptian heliocentrism whereby the sun was their primary deity, their primary god. The sun was Re, or for Akhenaten it was Atun, but still Re Harakti, Re of the horizon. And it was their primary god. And so he says at a deep level, Copernicus was remembering this, as was Kepler as well, with his 3 laws of planetary motion. They were still in a certain resonance with the Egyptian relationship to the stars, and especially with the sun. He says also that Paracelsus, with the medical theory that he revived, was also reviving, in a certain sense, remembering a past lifetime in Egypt when he could remember being a physician, and there was a certain degree to which his version of medicine is a recrudescence of Egyptian medical lore, and so on. So we have these individuals who are able to reactivate deep, deep memories of previous lives in the Egyptian civilization. And so in a certain respect, we are repeating the Egyptian civilization on a higher turn of the spiral. But unlike the Egyptians, where we have developed incredibly complex tools, whereas the Egyptians had relatively primitive tools, grinding their corn between two kerns, and they had a poor relationship to their tools, but a vast relationship to the lofty heights of their spirituality, whereby they could use such primitive tools to build incredible works like the pyramids. Whereas with our tools are just the opposite. They have become these gigantic machines that have come out of the earth. And in a certain way, the steam engine actually did come out of the earth. It began as a special type of pump in the 17th century for drawing water up out of mine shafts, for draining the excess water out of mine shafts in these operations. So in a way, the steam engine did actually come out of the earth. And the metals, too, with which these machines are made are transformed minerals, of course. So our machines have come out of the earth, and we have become the slaves of physical matter. And there has been a corresponding diminishment, unlike the Egyptians, with their primitive tools in our relationship to the spiritual plane. And so Steiner concludes then this lecture with saying that these are things that we are meant as spiritual scientists, and here he's referring specifically to the community of anthroposophists, to kindle in our hearts as germs that will germinate and grow out of these seeds into a much larger movement, the same way that the Christians began as a disaffected internal proletariat who came out of the catacombs. They were torn apart in the gladiatorial arenas. Incense was waved over their bodies, and they were looked down upon, but eventually they had the way to the future. And what has become of the Roman Imperium, it's gone, but Christianity has survived as the official religion of the West for 2,000 years. And he says, likewise, we in the anthroposophical movement are at an early beginning here, where we're just planting seeds that will grow eventually into something mighty that will transform and transubstantiate this current civilization that we are inhabiting into a whole different spiritually infused civilization in which the Christ impulse has penetrated into a fundamental and deep degree. And so that wraps it up for this lecture cycle of Rudolf Steiner's Egyptian Myths and Mysteries, 12 lectures. And next we'll move on to another Rudolf Steiner lecture series on the spiritual hierarchies and their relation to the planets and the zodiac. So stay tuned for that.